record button. Okay, and I think we are going. Good afternoon, bienvenidas a todos. It's great to see so many new and so many familiar faces here. I'm very happy to welcome you all today for the first panel on Spanish in the Inclusive Language Across Latin America series, sponsored by OSU Center for Latin American Studies, or CLAS as we call it. My name is Mark Hoff. I'm Assistant Director of CLAS, and my pronouns are he in English, él in Spanish. And I'm very excited about the conversation we have planned for you today. This is something that's been a while in the planning and the making, and so we're very happy to see it finally coming to fruition. As you may know, this is the first of 3 conversations about inclusive language across Latin America that we'll be hosting. So stay tuned for those. On November 2nd, we'll have a panel discussion about Brazilian Portuguese, and on November 15th, we'll have a discussion about 3 indigenous languages sort of all together: Nahuatl, Yucatec Maya, and Quechua. You can reach the event page and the registration page for each of those events from the link for the series that I'm going to put in the chat here. Let me do that real quick for you. There we go. And one of my future goals for the future programming in CLAS is to really amplify queer voices in the region and to highlight the diversity of Latin American communities of all sorts. So I'm hoping that today is going to be sort of the first step in that direction, and hopefully the first of many conversations on topics like this. As you can see, we are recording each event in this series. The videos will be available on our website shortly after the event, so please feel free to share widely with any friends or colleagues you have who maybe weren't able to attend today. And also be sure to check out the recordings of the other 2 conversations if you're unable to make either of those other dates. Now I'll turn it over to Scott for just a couple words if you want to make some introductions, Scott.
Yeah, I just wanted to greet everyone. I'm Scott Schwenter, the director of the Center for Latin American Studies and a professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. And this is a really exciting endeavor that we're embarking on today. And really, Mark deserves most of the credit. So please be sure to give him all your applause, which I'm sure I will say at least 2 more times in the other panels that we're going to have. And it's just a wonderful, a timely topic for us. And it spans across a lot of different disciplines. And one of our goals has been to try to do that. And so this is really a first step towards that goal. So thank you all for attending. I hope you'll attend the Portuguese and Indigenous language panels as well. And you know, also feel free to follow our other programming, subscribe to our newsletter. We have lots of very fun and exciting things going on. So with that, I'll throw it back to Mark for the introductions.
Great, thanks, Scott. Yeah, absolutely do check out our website. That's class.osu.edu. We have all kinds of fun stuff on there as well. And now I'll go ahead and introduce our moderator for today's panel on inclusive language in Spanish. Today we have Dr. Daniel Diaz Reyes of Union Institute and University, which is actually Ohio's only officially designated Hispanic serving institution. And that's a partnership we're really proud to be working with. Dr. Diaz Reyes holds both a PhD and a JD and teaches in the Education Studies concentration of the interdisciplinary doctoral program at Union. He has a very diverse professional background in anthropology, education, ethnic studies, and law. And his definition of community is based with the Afro-Indigenous people of Costa Chica and the Nahuatl speakers of Southern Mexico and the diaspora. His current research focuses primarily on pedagogical praxis, the politics of schooling, and curricular design to support the implementation of liberatory projects in education. His many projects address education systems as sites of social reproduction to examine transnationalism, human movements, and youth culture, with a special focus on Black Brown, Chicana, Latinx, and Indigenous communities. So I think you can all see why he's such a great fit for our moderator today. Thank you, Danny, for sharing your expertise with us today and leading us in what I hope will be a very interactive, informative, probably very bilingual code switched conversation. And with that, I'll turn it over for you to introduce the panelists and get our conversation started.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mark, Scott, and everyone in attendance. I'll just briefly start by maybe offering the context that I hope we can share today. As the moderator, I'm really hoping to just be able to facilitate or eavesdrop on a conversation. That would be my role. And I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to do so. I'll begin by introducing the panel. I'll read their descriptions as written. Ben Papadopoulos is a doctoral student and graduate student instructor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of California, Berkeley. He's also the founder of the Gender and Language Project, genderandlanguage.com. His research is based around the linguistics and theoretical linguistics of gender-inclusive language, with particular focus on the expression of non-binary gender identities in masculine, feminine, gendered languages. We also have panelist Paula José Quintero, PhD. Her PhD is as a clinical psychologist with Fundación Foro para la Salud Mental in Buenos Aires. She is trained in, teaches about, and has published extensively on dialectical behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, behavioral activation for depression. She has also shared her work on inclusive language and its psychological effect, among many other topics in public-facing fora, such as Ciencia. We also have Ártemis López as a panelist. Ártemis López is a PhD candidate in linguistics at the Universidad de Vigo in Galicia, Spain, where they research non-binary Spanish. They hold an MA in medical translation with Universidad Juame, also in Spain, and have been translating and interpreting professionally for over a decade. Again, I repeat my gratitude at the opportunity to facilitate this conversation. My goal is that we are able to use this space as an opportunity to work through, almost as a workshop, through our respective focus, professionally as well as personally. I think one of the things that I'm excited about is the role of language in shaping and building our communities, so that in this conversation, we really kind of think about just the emphasis, the primary goal of how we can look at language and really see its network effect in different, whether it be social, political, economic, even manifestations. What I'd like to do is pose a couple questions, and since it's only three of us, there's three panelists and myself as four, I think we'll be able to kind of just go in rotation. If at any point I ask a question, you're more than welcome to let me know if you want to answer it or pass it on to someone else. I'll begin with a very generalized question, which has to do with just where we are in our understanding of inclusivity and language. And again, whether it's Ben, Paola, or Artemis can begin.
I'm really afraid to start speaking. Can I use Spanish? I don't know.
Sí, está bien.
Sí, okay. The question was where we are at. I think my impression, I just really love the subject, and I have been reading research about it, but it's not my area of expertise. So I think I'm gonna learn a lot of this panel, which is really exciting. I think we are at trying to find a way. We are in the journey, not with the results, no? Which is really like a good start for me. At least in our country, the sense is we are trying new forms of communicate diversity, inclusive, including other different people, women or not non-binary people. And we are searching, trying, testing. I think that's where we are. It's just my view of it. No, I'm not an expert in language, but I think we are in that way, trying if it is acceptable, if it is used, how were the attitudes toward that. I say I was going to speak in Spanish, and I think I'm talking in English. Perdón. I will do my best. Was that the question, Daniel, or I misunderstood?
No, it is, in fact, I just think it's a good starter to think about sharing how we perceive in our respective locations where we are in terms of this topic. And you've started us off, Paula. Thank you very much. Ben, Artemis?
Sure, I can speak to that question. First of all, I think I speak for the three of us when I say we're so happy to be here and to see an event put on about gender inclusive Spanish. And thank you so much for having us and for this opportunity. My pronouns are he or they. I can't quite edit my Zoom. It's very funny, they're always there, and I've taught on Zoom for a year, so I'm quite sorry that I can't figure it out right now. So I'm in Berkeley, California, where I study gender inclusive language, and I sort of look out on the rest of the world from my own bias, right? And so I come from an English language culture, and in particular, I also come from the queer culture, right? And in those two cultures, I feel like gender inclusive language is such a phenomenon. And when I go out into the world and tell people about what I'm working on, they say to me, oh my God, that's essential. Like, isn't that very well represented in linguistics? And I say to them, actually, it's still about as marginalized as really could be, which makes me very sad. So in my career, basically, when I was beginning to write my senior thesis as an undergraduate, I worked in a cafe across from our multicultural student center. And I would always see the word Latinx, Latinx this, pasted all over the walls. And I would go to my linguistics classes and try and learn about the appearance of gender in language. And I would get told absolutely nothing. And today, it really is a new field in academia. On the ground, the queer community is doing a lot in all kinds of languages to represent non-binary identities. And now us researchers are trying to bring this data into the academy and into the ivory tower so that we can legitimize it, represent it in a positive way, right? And sort of lay the foundation to do this kind of research. On the academic front, we are building a strong community. Some of us are represented here today, and it makes me so proud. On the level of the community, different languages look quite different. Of course, I want us to remember that different languages can encode gender in stronger or weaker ways. So for instance, Spanish and all of the other Romance languages, we literally have a morphological system of binary gender encoded throughout the language, in which every single word has to be masculine or feminine. So for this reason, maybe, Spanish is one of the primary target languages to research in terms of how a system like this can change. Right? And I have to say, based on my own analysis, that from my perspective, it seems like Spanish has the most sort of innovations going on within it. And the situation in other languages looks kind of worse. And it really goes so on and so forth in a sequence. And some of the most gendered languages rather in the world, like Hindi, we actually see not a whole lot of non-binary forms for. So in Spanish, the situation differs obviously by country as well. So I am in the US, where a lot of these things are visible to me and to my communities, right? But gender inclusive language is still really illegible to so many people across Latin America. And it's for two reasons. They either don't want the language as a property in and of itself to change, or they don't recognize the concept of non-binary gender and therefore can't quite understand the interconnection of the two, the language and the genders in society. So it still is very disparate, but growing. And thank you again for having us.
There's my unmute button. So yes, also thank you so much for inviting us. I'm really, really excited for this panel today. So first off, I will be, the people who are here in the panel with me know about this already. Like, I speak about non-binary language. That's the term that I use for this rather than inclusive language, because in my research, I've found that inclusive language also includes like inclusive of women or inclusive of people of color. So I'm specifically talking about non-binary language. And then, yes, I research non-binary Spanish. So answering, I guess, from myself further out, I was using the, English E, Spanish A. It's very confusing to speak about this letter. I was using the A when I was all the way in high school. I am using it now. I use non-binary Spanish literally every day because I'm in all of my conversations, right? So within me, it's being used every single day. My friends tend to use it every day as well, just because they speak to me. But going further out, some queers and feminists are using it. Some of them are using like what's called a generic feminine. So they're avoiding the masculine, but they're not using the e, so they're using a feminine. Some people don't really know about it. Everybody knows, in the same way that in the US, everyone is aware of Latinx, even if they don't use it, even if they don't like it. I feel like everyone's aware of it. In Spain, everyone's aware of todes, and the todes famoso, like everyone's talking about todes. So when, you know, a politician starts a speech and says todos, todas y todes, that will go on the news like, oh, there's the progressives using todes again. They're so obnoxious. I was in a conference just this past week that's called Maricornes, and it's this, I don't know, overlapping, like different, wow, my English right now is super failing me. Interdisciplinary conference, that's what it's called. It's an interdisciplinary queer studies conference. And it was really cool because I went to it 2 years ago. And when I went to it, pretty much nobody used this morpheme. I went to it hoping to find somebody who was researching non-binary Spanish. I found nobody, and that's actually kind of why I started my PhD. And it was really cool to go this year and watch how the first couple of sessions, people were careful about using it, and then they didn't find any resistance. And by the end of it, everybody was using it. Like at the closing event, the organizers were using it with absolute ease. The director of the university was using it as well. So I think in some spaces, it's definitely used with, I mean, really comfortably and with fluidity, I guess, would be how it's described. But there's just a lot of hesitancy about what other people will say about it. So that's how I'm seeing it in Spain right now.
Well, thank you very much for putting together a beginning context to this conversation. One of the things I wanted to echo back to the group and the audience is that I hear that when we talk about language, specifically looking at whether it's non-binary or the term inclusive language, there is a newness to it. And it feels that we're in a conversation that for some, it's the first time they've heard it. For others, you're like, I've been with this language my whole life. But we acknowledge something as a common conversation, that there are new forms of language being presented. And one of the things that I wanted to see if we can start talking about is looking at the context of use of the language, in particular the divide between what we can consider the academic space and the non-academic space, maybe call it community. One of the common points of discussion that I've been engaging with in my classes and in same circles of the academic context is that there's a way of questioning what is the role between the academic sphere and the non-academic sphere that is not as versed, and I would even say with a little bit of care, as invested. Because in the non-academic space, there's a conversation that I get in response like, that's not my language. Like, this is what I use. That may be fine for you, but I'm not going to comply. That resistance. And what I'd like to see if we can start talking about is the politics of language in terms of context. So that as we think about the language, particularly how we've emphasized that here we're using Spanish, even though there are many other languages that gender code in their words. But when we talk about Spanish, here we're talking about Spanish as we speak English, which is even more interesting. But I want to repeat the context of this, of what I pose here. What is the relationship between the academic context of language analysis, language building, and its outside or non-academic context? And maybe we'll go in reverse order this time. Artemis, would you start us off?
Sure. So I think there's a very interesting thing about this relationship between academic and non-academic, in that the complaints that I hear about non-binary Spanish, non-binary language in general, is that it's coming from academia and it's being, like pushed onto us, which I'm watching Ben roll their eyes because I agree. I think what's happening is the people who are finally using it in public and with some sort of like power or standing behind them are people in academia or in government. But people outside of academia have been using it for decades, like absolutely decades. It's just people outside of academia are not listened to. So there's just been a very weird cycle of finally academia is listening to the people outside, and now different people outside are saying that it's coming from academia and that it's being pushed down onto them. And I'm not really sure of how to bridge that gap or how to fix that, because I'm sure that I know that there are people in academia trying to dictate how it should be rather than how it is. But it's really difficult to explain to somebody who hasn't come into contact with it before that really it's not coming from academia. It's just some people are sharing what has been around before.
Good points, good points. So I was rolling my eyes because in my context of the United States, our academic institutions are a white male hegemony. Still, I think that's probably the case in many of the countries y'all are joining us from today. And so the idea that this has come from academia doesn't sit right with me, for the reason that me and my team of researchers, we go and analyze what's being done in the community. And often my researchers will come back to me and say, well, this is not a legitimate source. It wasn't published in a journal, or it wasn't someone's thesis. And I say to them, you have found the most legitimate source that we need, which is a community member posting on Non-Binary Wiki or on Twitter and talking about the terms that they use to self-identify. And one of the best lessons I ever learned actually was reading a thesis by Garasi Lara y Casa, who wrote this thesis called Proposición X in Spain, I think in Madrid. And it was a wonderful thesis that basically had the point of describing the use of the X as a trans-feminist artistic project. And the one line that they said that always stuck out with me is, by me writing about this and publishing it as a thesis and entering it into academia, I can legitimize it. So the interplay between the community and the academy, to me, is that I, in my position as an academic here at the institution, can perform my research on this language, and by doing so, legitimize it. Now, people ask me, why is that important? I basically went to a conference, and after presenting my whole thing, I had a tenured professor say, what was the purpose of any of this? What are you doing? Are you just trying to describe things? And I simply said, yes, I am trying to describe things. A lot of things in linguistic theory are said, that gender is an arbitrary feature of language, that it has nothing to do with people, and the theory is bad as it stands. So by me collecting this data, analyzing it, researching it, right, formulating my own arguments about gender and language, I can correct a theory, potentially, that is used to castigate and denigrate so many people who want to use language simply to self-identify. In the case of Spanish, it's more difficult too, because there are actually very few options within the language as it exists. In English, we are quite lucky that we have this pronoun they that is recognized as legitimate. Perhaps people don't like that it's being used for non-binary identities, but they can't say it's ungrammatical. In Spanish, the context is completely different, because of course it's bound to be ungrammatical, as it's something that simply doesn't exist in the grammar, and queer communities have a very uphill battle of carving out an entire gender category throughout the grammar and making it systematic so that other people can understand it. So for me, the relationship is very integral to my research, and I sort of sit at both ends of the spectrum as a community member and as an academic, and I try and balance the two. But activism and scholarship is so important here. I think that people like the RAE, the Real Academia Española, really cite linguistic theory as the ones that are saying these things about language, right? When it's up to academics in my generation and our generation here to sort of correct the ways that people in society think about what linguists do and how they go about their work and what their work is really meant to do. And in my case, it's meant to legitimize non-binary people and their forms of language.
Thank you. Paola.
Daniel, ¿podrías repetir la pregunta en español? Porque
Sí, muy
creo
bien.
que mi contexto es muy diferente y quiero asegurarme de que entendí bien.
Sí, la pregunta es esta, de que hay un contexto donde no se critica, bueno, una vez se critica, otra vez más se evalúa, de que esta conversación sobre lenguaje e inclusividad está tomando forma dentro de la academia, las universidades, y no necesariamente fuera, en la comunidad o comunidades. Entonces se usa como crítica donde se ve que este diálogo está siendo importado o exportado y no necesariamente refleja lo que las comunidades de afuera están expresando. Entonces, dentro de esa conversación, ¿cómo respondes?
Claro. Es muy interesante porque en nuestro contexto, al menos lo que yo capto del contexto argentino, esta no es para nada una comunicación académica, una propuesta académica, así que nadie criticaría el lenguaje inclusivo no sexista como una propuesta académica. Surge de la mano de un movimiento feminista muy fuerte en Argentina, y es un movimiento social y político, por supuesto. Y yo creo que los académicos están intentando ver qué hacen con eso, más que el camino contrario. Por supuesto que es un tema de más de 40 años de investigación, pero en Argentina al menos la propuesta surge de algo más popular y feminista, y no es una propuesta académica en absoluto. Hay algunas instituciones académicas que están intentando tomar posición con respecto al lenguaje inclusivo, sobre todo instituciones educativas públicas están intentando diagramar algunos instructivos para aceptar el uso, para nada imponerlo, pero aceptar el uso de estudiantes preparando trabajos y tesis con lenguaje inclusivo. Y estamos ahí. Pero al menos, de nuevo, desde mi lugar, es más un movimiento desde lo social político hacia la academia, y no desde la academia hacia lo social político, con lo cual yo más bien diría que la crítica más fuerte no es una crítica hacia el intelectualismo, sino más bien una crítica política. Al menos en Argentina se empezó a identificar el uso del lenguaje no binario inclusivo con una corriente política en particular, y a veces hay resistencia a usarlo solo porque se asoció a esa corriente política, no necesariamente partidaria, pero sí política. Algo de lo que decía Ártemis del progresismo, bueno, pero surge más, creo yo, desde lo social hacia lo académico y no a la inversa en Argentina. Tomen con pinzas esto porque es mi súper perspectiva personal, pero creo que va más por ahí. Por eso no terminaba de entender la pregunta. No sé si respondí, ¿se entendió algo? Digo algo en inglés, no sé si las personas entendieron o alguien quiere traducir un poquito, me avisan.
Pues Paola, con tu permiso, ¿te gustas que yo intente resumir lo que dijiste?
Sí,
tú puedes
encantada,
hacer
Daniel. No, mejor vos.
hacemos turnos. La palabra otra vez tú.
Me da menos trabajo.
Gracias.
A vos.
Let me just kind of code switch a little bit. I'll begin with Paola's direction. The question really posed as a context for this talk is whether, or what do we respond to? How do we respond to this? I don't know if the right word is critique, but yeah, sometimes it's used as a critique, where the conversation around inclusive language or questioning gendered language is brought forward as it being an imposed or exported subject from the university's intellectual circle, and not reflective of what the communities outside are actually living. In terms of what I heard from the panel, is Lily, I think unanimously, no, that's not the case. That in fact, if we really look and listen, it is the community, the different communities outside of what we call the academy, the university setting, the intellectual circles, that are leading this direction, this new form of building words, building grammar, really forcing the universities to actually respond to and not lead. One of the things that Paula stated was that whenever the critique of gendered language being an intellectually imposed pattern or movement, it's actually much more of a flag or notice that it is a political rhetoric to critique it. So it's a way of escaping accountability, so that it becomes an issue of simply stating that seems to be an intellectual conversation and not really reflective of what the popular movement is. But in Paola's narrative, she expressed that she identifies it as being a tool of maybe just critiquing or disempowering the movement. I'd like to actually maybe direct there. One of the things I noticed from all three speakers is the emphasis on how language operates as a form of control. And I hope, how can we address that topic? How are some of the ways that we respectively address language and its relationship to control? I'll translate in Spanish so that Paula has context. Paola, la pregunta que voy a ofrecer ahora es ¿cómo es el lenguaje una forma de control? Entonces, ¿por qué no empezamos contigo, Paola, el lenguaje como una forma de control? ¿Cómo tú manejas ese tema?
Gracias, Daniel, por la traducción de mi comentario anterior. No manejo mucho ese tema. Voy a decir algo breve, seguro Ben y Ártemis tienen más para decir. La cultura, entiendo, es una forma de control y también tiene sus beneficios, ¿no? Como un espacio de límites y un espacio de posibilidades. Lo que sí me parece claro con este movimiento de intentar modificar algunas cosas del lenguaje, al menos en castellano, con lo que es el masculino genérico, es que hay mucha resistencia, y yo creo que en un punto tiene que ver con algunos significados que el masculino genérico instala en la cultura. No me parece, hay muchas barreras. Yo tengo una investigación que se hizo en Argentina sobre las barreras para usar el lenguaje inclusivo. Hay muchas, pero pareciera que uno a nivel control que destaca es cuánto influye la invisibilización de disidencias. Pareciera que hay alguna resistencia emocional, hay algunas resistencias también intelectuales que son interesantes y las tenemos que tener en cuenta si queremos ampliar el uso de este tipo de lenguaje o facilitarlo, por supuesto. Pero pareciera que hay una resistencia bastante emocional a poder incluir o visibilizar aquellas personas que quedan invisibilizadas. Sin embargo, creo que hay otros obstáculos culturales que no tienen que... Al control, desde mi punto de vista y como psicóloga, sí creo que cultura implica control y lenguaje es cultura, con lo cual no reniegaría tanto de eso, sino de ver de qué formas podemos facilitar los caminos al uso, bajando un poco la defensividad. O sea, poniendo en nuestro lado, ¿no? Si hay una cuestión de control, cómo intentar disminuir la defensividad, que es muy alta, al menos en Argentina. Nada, va por ahí. Me avisan, ¿eh? If I'm talking about something that has nothing to do with it, please tell me. I'm a little insecure, as you may know. Me avisan, you let me know.
Pues te iba a preguntar, Paola, si gustas intentar de hacer un resumen breve o como gustes en inglés, traducirlo.
De las barreras, about the
Lo que quieras
barriers.
ofrecer.
No, Daniel, if you can, I will be really happy if you can make a...
Muy bien, muy bien. De aquí adelante
Yes.
yo voy a hacer un resumen breve. Me parece que
Gracias.
el
Gracias.
público está versa en los dos idiomas. Entonces, I'll try and just offer a brief translation so I don't interrupt the conversation. But for those of you that are bilingual, you understood Paola, and I apologize for doing a not fair translation of what she stated. But the question was about issue of control. And it's very vague, my question. However, her response responded that it is an issue. There are definitely issues of resistance. There's barriers to change. One of the issues on, for example, using the masculine context as a generic for everyone, and that there is a marker of visibility that comes about when we talk about change. In particular, the relationship between culture and language. But however, she mentioned that the question of control was not something that was necessarily her strength. However, her conversation indicated that there's much work to be done, and that there is a relationship that she identifies between culture and language and its outcome of models. I will ask Ben to follow up, please.
Sure. So language as control.
In whichever format you want to use that. It's so vague, but I was thinking about that when I go through the conversations that we've been sharing, there's places that people talk about policing languages, but also resistance to that policing. So the question of control, or the word control, popped into my head, and I thought about wherever you feel comfortable taking that context, however you use it.
Thank you. So I work with a concept that's called linguicism, linguicismo in español. And the basic insight about linguicism is that when someone is discriminated against on the basis of their use of language, so for instance, if I'm trying to tell a Spanish L1 speaker, Spanish is their first language, and I'm trying to tell this person that you don't speak good enough English, that is almost always also a racist insight. It can be a gendered insight. It can be a class insight. It really tells us something in terms of language as a reflection of society, right? I think people forget that the shape of a language itself is an agentive creation. So for instance, people like to say that because we have masculine and feminine genders in Spanish, this doesn't mean anything. It's just a convention. It's just the way the language works. Well, there's something that we call the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is actually the theory of linguistic relativity, put differently. And this hypothesis states, it's very 1984-like, it states that the ways a language sort of shapes the world, or the categories and constraints of a given language, can literally control our thought. That is the strong version of the hypothesis. The weak version of the hypothesis is that the categories and constraints in a given language have a tendency, or a tendential constraint on our thought. I'm going to take that side of it, the weak version, and think about why we are thinking this way. So is it the case that the original sort of speakers of Proto-Indo-European maybe really considered gender to be that important that it became grammaticalized in language, right? My point here is that it's not a coincidence that we have genders in language that are called masculine and feminine. And in fact, it's very well documented that Latin grammarians would use the terms sexus and genus, right? So sex and gender, and interplay them, right, to describe the system of gender, but it has great meaning. So a language can be policed from above and from below. On a community level, speakers love to police language, right? And they always do it in relation to some standard. And that standard is also created, it is also maintained, and in the case of Spanish, it is very explicitly policed by these language academies, also by governments that adopt this language. That's why when Paula was saying about how the Argentine government is in small ways trying to sort of legitimize the use of this language, or prepare for its legitimization, that this is a very important concept, because the shape of a language is actually controlled, and it's sort of an above and below thing where we on the level of the community are the ones that then have to break that hegemony and change it. So language, of course, is integral to our identities. It's how we have all of these racial, gendered, class hierarchies in the first place. And I think we need to take really seriously the concept of language change, that a language can and should change, right? If some constraints that it imposes are not sort of fitting our vision of the world anymore. I'm sorry if that was too vague. I'll maybe get back to it.
Thank you. Artemis?
So when I was a kid, I was a prescriptivist. I was, and I was raised a prescriptivist, and I was like an 8-year-old child using like these huge thesaurus words, and I thought that made me better.
What? I'm sorry, I don't know what that is.
A prescriptivist, there's like these two schools of linguistic thought. It doesn't need to be linguistics. And descriptivism is like, this is how people are speaking, and prescriptivism is, this is how people should speak. Right. So when I was a kid, I was like correcting grown-ups. I was correcting my teachers in class. It's very embarrassing when I think about it.
It's fun.
But so like I got to the US and I became an even stronger prescriptivist, and I'm getting somewhere, I promise. In that I got to a point where I, as an English as a second language speaker, was correcting English as first language speakers, English L1s. And I thought that if I could learn all of these rules as an L2, then they should know all of these rules too. And eventually I like broke out of that thought. But what I'm getting at is like when my family corrects me too, and it's not even corrections that I don't know. I use regionalisms a lot. I love regionalisms. I love I don't know, constructions that aren't correct but are definitely in use, and I use them a lot. And when my family corrects that, they're not doing that because they think I don't know it. When a stranger corrects me, they don't think that I don't know it. It's because they want to legitimize this standard that Ben was talking about, right? So you need to speak good Spanish, good English, good whatever it is, in order to access a better job and in order to get a raise and to do all of these things. And if we challenge that, which is part of what's happening with non-binary Spanish, we're not only challenging it for ourselves. I'm not only endangering my own hypothetical future job, but I'm endangering everyone's, because then everyone could get access to things regardless of how they speak, right? Like everybody languages correctly. I think there's also like a special thing about non-binary Spanish in that even people who wouldn't correct my regionalisms will correct my non-binary Spanish, right? And like expect me to speak in a binary way. So there's definitely also some transphobia in there, some binarism, some misogyny, definitely. But part of it is definitely that people feel that if we rock the system in any way, if we realize that the dictionary doesn't matter, we're also going to endanger their own status quo and their own legitimacy.
Oh, thank you for that direction. One of the things that I noticed in the conversation has to do with the relation between understanding that our spaces, our cultural spaces, one, are always changing, but they're also responding to something that does not want to change. So this tension between being told this is the way you're supposed to speak when you are already speaking. So it's very interesting for me to notice this interplay of culture being dictated while it is changing at the same time. And I was hoping that maybe we could talk a little bit about that. As was described earlier, my background is in the discipline of anthropology. So I work with the concept of culture extensively in the other spaces, whether they be law, ethnic studies, or education. But one of the things that I noticed about culture and its common term is that people like to compartmentalize it. Like you're wearing a very cultural shirt, or that's a cultural language. But I want to think about the way that most of us think about culture as a domain of existence. It's a place you live in holistically, and language is one of those elements that we express. I'm curious of how the panel addresses culture as an expression, a place we live in terms of its relationship to language, and the topics we've been addressing. I'll translate it in Spanish before I pose the question. La conversación que quisiera saber si podemos tener es sobre el tema de cultura. En sí, la palabra cultura en antropología se usa un poco diferente o más amplia del uso cotidiano, donde la costumbre es decir que tienes una camisa cultural o estás hablando un idioma cultural, como que algo que se puede usar y hacer, pero no necesariamente vivir dentro. Dentro de la conversación que quisiera proponer es cuáles son los modelos que usamos nosotros para hablar sobre el concepto de cultura y su relación al tema que tenemos ahorita. Es útil para nosotros usar el tiempo para explicar cómo manejamos el tema de cultura, y en este momento empezó otra vez quisiera abrirlo a cualquier persona que quiera iniciar la conversación. So I'll pause here on the calling on individuals and ask if anyone would like to initiate the conversation.
Do you want one of the panelists, one of us, or one of?
I was going to begin with the panelists, but I see a hand. So is the panel open to take a pause so we can maybe have a dialogue with the audience?
Absolutely.
Yes. See. Okay. Let me see. I'm going to need some help because I cannot see the whole audience. I saw a hand, but I can't see the whole.
I don't know if they can mute them or unmute themselves.
I don't think they can.
I see a button to ask to unmute. Oh, there we go.
I do.
Or what I can do.
Everybody should be able to unmute if whoever has a question wants to just come off mute.
Yeah, I do can, but I can also wait for the keynote speakers to finish. So don't worry. It was maybe I would like to know what they think about some other issues. I can bring up the perspective from Mexico City's academia, and this movement is kind of different from how it is seen in Argentina, and it's been really seeing something related with colonialism. And the idea is like, as well as queer studies, it seems like something that is imposed on our context, which is different from the Western context. So many people, what they think is like this thing about non-sexist language, non-binary language, is not really it's not a real linguistic change, but it's something that is imposed. So that is the vision of the academias from Mexico City, at least I can say. And the first time that I heard about it, the first time that I heard todes was from a group of people in a psychologist group. So it was not from academia, it was from a psychological group. And they kind of fighting between, is this really something imposed, this non-binary language from academias as well as queer studies, that they actually change from QUEER to CUIR, so just to adapt it. And yeah, the thing is, I also think that the non-binary language needs, it's more complex than that, because you can use an for example. It works well for most of the nouns and adjectives that refers to people, but you have issues when you want to talk about determiners for most of nouns, and you have also problems with participios activos, when you have presidente and you have the but it is associated with the male noun. So it's so associated, it's that associated with the male noun, that it's also, there's a movement to understand that you can also be a presidenta. So it sometimes doesn't really work that well for everything. So I think the interesting part is like to look what the speakers do to deal with those aspects, because the movement is like, we don't want to show gender in my language, even though my language is kind of restricting me in that aspect. And I would like to ask, what do you think? Because you talk about that thing that my language restricts my view of the world, though you can also have some societies, very sexist societies, which don't mark gender at all in the language, such as you can have Mandarin, that in the writing system, they do mark gender, but in the oral system, they don't. But at the same time, I think that if it's not important for a social group, you don't get it in the grammar. What would be your thoughts about it?
That was so helpful, Pedro Antonio. Thank you so much. You gave me a great place to go from. I wanted to talk about colonialism first, if y'all will allow me. So this is very interesting. So when we are describing non-binary language, that represents a culture of non-binary people, a locally specific one. So that's the interconnection there in the first place. On another level, we can say with a lot of confidence that most of the indigenous languages of Latin America definitely did not have a system of grammatical gender. And in fact, it's yet to be determined if they even had meaningful words, like in English, brother and sister, to me creates a gender distinction and is evidence of gender in language. We have this third term, sibling. So we have an option that exists, right? But for something like niece and nephew and niece, we've had to create a word, nibbling, right? So back to Latin America. All of the indigenous languages of Latin America, it seems, did not have a system of grammatical gender, at least not in the way at all of the masculine, feminine gender of Indo-European, right? And they also had very different gender and sexuality categories, right? And they probably used many, many words that we have not uncovered or translated correctly to represent locally specific, meaningful cultural identities, right? So one thing that happens in the imposition of Spanish is implicated in this colonial sort of colonization of being. This is Maldonado Torres's concept. And basically this says that in colonization, the mythologies, the cosmologies, and the identities and the knowledge of people in indigenous communities is something to be colonized. And the Spanish language represents one way in which a binary gendered understanding has been imposed upon an entire continent and now is taken by some speakers to be a fact regardless of history. So you get a lot of people now that understand the decolonization of the Spanish language in Latin America as undoing those gendered categories, and that this is some sort of cultural reflection, right? From the past to the present as a through line. But then there are the people that sort of abandon the history of the language. And for instance, coming from a US English perspective, they like to say that something like gender inclusive language, non-binary language, represents the colonization of the language because some outside influence is acting on it, right? Which we can sort of rectify these understandings. Interestingly, the X, right, X in Spanish is seen in a lot of indigenous languages. And so the exact opposite understanding exists, that when you sort of decolonize a language or erase its gender with an X, with an E, or with any other symbol, that this is a primary decolonial tool, right? So language and culture are always going to be related. And that's why in linguistics, I get so frustrated when people divorce language from the social context in which it was created, because they're undivorceable. You know, so thank you so much, Pedro Antonio, for your wonderful comment.
And I'll pick it up. That was amazing, Ben. Thank you. I'll pick up, I guess, on the irregulars, which I think are the most interesting part of non-binary Spanish, right? Because I can just tell you like, oh, you just plug in like an E wherever there's an A and that's it, you're done. That part's easy, but yes, like there's the determiners, there's, I was going to say irregular word pairs. They're not irregular, they're actually regular, but word pairs like emperador, emperatriz, so for emperor, empress, and like that dor and that triz, we do know those are gender morphemes that we are familiar with, but we don't have, it's not the O, it's not the A, we don't have like a third one coined just yet. And I think that's where the really cool descriptive stuff is right now. For solutions for words like presidente, what I'm seeing in Spain, we have a lot of languages besides Spanish, and two of the ones that we have are Catalan and Galician is spoken where I'm at. And in Galician, some is, I'm speaking about the same letter here. Some of them will be masculine, and then in Catalan, some of them are feminine. It's sort of like French in that. So they can't just straight up do the E for everything because it just simply doesn't work, right? So what's happening in both of those languages is they are using an when the e does not have another meaning. So I don't know, Spanish, niño, niña, niñe, niñe doesn't exist, it doesn't have another meaning, right? If it does have a meaning, like in presidente, they are using a Spanish E, which is an English I. So we're saying presidente. I've also seen like IE, so presidentie, because in Galician, they really like that ie, delio. But that's what's happening in Spain. That's what's happening in these non-Spanish languages. What's happening there is that it's also moving into Spanish, because these Catalan and Galician speakers generally also speak Spanish. So when they're using Spanish, they're using that same resource in Spanish, because they do have all these irregulars and there's all these spaces that they don't know what to do with. So that's one of the approaches that I'm seeing here. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of different ones. So I just think, yeah, like the irregulars are the really cool thing about non-binary Spanish.
Paula?
My Zoom got off for some minutes, so if I was feeling inadequate before, imagine now. But about what Artemis was saying about presidente, it's a really important point. I work in psychology about function of behavior, not as much as topography. And inclusive language, when we think about how to use it in Spanish, is really much about topography. When do I put the e, no? In which words? Subject, things doesn't need to change, pronouns does need to change. But I think sometimes when we use inclusive language with the e in English, it's enough to change the pronoun. So you can say le presidente, but you can say le presidente also, and just changing the pronoun, the function is met, which means calling the attention to, okay, we are not just talking about men here. And sometimes in some context, changing everything in using inclusive language can be really confusing. I'm talking about academic context or professional context, and we can change maybe a little bit and the function is met. I don't know if I'm being clear. I remember a conference in Argentina. Pibes is a word we use in Argentina to name young people. Las pibas, los pibes, will be chicas, chicos, we use pibes. Pibes has the same problem that Artemis was talking about presidente. So, and I remember a conference, a person said, les pibis. And it was really okay about inclusive language, but it's really, all the conversation was about pibis and why he said pibis, and it lost the function of, no, like the focus was not in the inclusiveness, and the focus was on, no, how ridiculous it sounds, pibis. So from my working with it, I think just changing some pronouns sometimes met the function of inclusiveness. So there is this dilemma of perfect topography and no, the necessary function for inclusiveness. Now, I don't know if you were talking about this because Zoom went off, and maybe you tell me. But I think function is really important when we talk about inclusiveness. And some people really, one barrier is I don't know how to use it well, perfect, no? I don't know exactly where to, do I have to say presidente? Okay, but sometimes just the pronoun, it's meeting the function of inclusiveness. At least where in my city, at least it's enough to take you to a place where we are not only talking about men or only talking about women, and we are including other identities.
I think
what I'd like to ask the panel if we can maybe shift a little bit the format. I think we're at the halfway point of the conversation right now. And one of the things that I'm curious is if there's something in particular that you would want to reference, whether we've touched upon it or you want to elaborate. So I'm asking if you can lead with more of your interest and intent to kind of speak on Paola's conversation intent. So you, I was thinking about maybe we could use the chat, or if you are comfortable with me calling on Artemis, for example, and put her, they on the spot, that is there something that we've spoken about that you want to return to and elaborate on?
This is a very hard question. I am definitely on the spot.
As I was thinking about the conversation intent that I've been posing questions, and I feel that I'm closing the opportunity to hear questions from the panel. We had one audience member offer direction, and I think that this would be a good point to maybe think about a much more ample direction from Ben. What about you? Is there anything that we've spoken about that you feel we could return to or maybe add to?
Yeah. Am I able to share my screen? I'm going to try it. I want to draw a little something for you all.
Yes, go. I think so.
Oh, good.
We see it. It's great.
Thank you so much. Okay, I just wanted to sort of, I want todos les tres, por favor, ayúdenme aquí. I wanted to just sort of describe some of the principles of gender inclusive language. So now that we're talking about it, we can sort of understand it. So I've been writing everything in the chat this way: masculine, feminine, and inclusive genders, okay? And then there is something interesting that happens in Spanish, right? A lot of nouns are like this, right? Or maybe like this. Okay, and then they have a very systematic way that they encode gender, right? It's these are the gender morphemes, right? These O's and A's. So for us, gender inclusive language comes in to solve this issue by proposing a morpheme that is gender inclusive, that we assign a meaning of gender inclusivity. Some of these morphemes, because if I have this right here, the word becomes amige, require a slight orthographic shift. So I'm actually going to take this away and preserve the sound in writing by choosing amigue instead. Niñe doesn't cause us any issue, just as good, totally fine. So for a word like estudiante, right? This I said is uncontroversial, y quiero preguntarles a los demás porque yo quiero saber si no es controversial o si es controversial tener esto. Oops. Now you know how my students feel. I don't think anyone feels like this is very controversial. And why is that, right? If the E in one noun form, it itself can change its gender, right? So when this word is being used and I say la estudiante, estudiante does have a gender, but it's only revealed to us when we match it up with the dependent elements, right? But for all intents and purposes, the noun is not gendered, or it does not create a masculine feminine distinction in and of itself. So for that reason, la estudiante está muy bien, right? Now the complication that we were talking about is this, right? Presidente, presidenta, hay mucha variación, pero aquí pongo presidenta, y luego no sabemos qué hacer. Now we don't know what to do, right? Because if we say presidente, that is now an somewhat exclusively masculine form, right? And presidenta makes that such. Because we have presidenta and we have presidente, we have a gender distinction. So we know that something must be done about it, right? What about presidente? It's kind of a gray area. What about presidenti? Like Artemis was saying, right? This is great because it's definitely not masculine. However, in languages like English, we have this: actor, actriz. And the way that the language has moved is sort of taking this word, reclaiming it in a way as inclusive or neutral. And now you see many women identifying actors, identifying themselves as actors, and many other people as well. So the situation is really, really nebulous. In general, we are looking for all of the ways that masculine, feminine distinctions can be codified in language. So as much as we like to say grammatical gender, grammatical gender, grammatical gender, there are lots of other ways too. So in Spanish, we have these words like yerno y nuera, right? That we really can't solve a solution between them. We actually have to come up with something, right? But the point I'd like to make here, and thank you so much, Dr. Diaz Reyes, for the opportunity to elaborate, is that anything you do is fine. That's the secret. Anything you do is great. And the second we start saying, you can do this, but you can't do that, right? Then our whole principles fall through, because any language used by people with the intent to represent themselves in the language as a certain gender identity is valid. Whatever you do is fine. People might understand it more or less if it's more systematic, but maybe it doesn't have to be. And some people enjoy that there is a non-systematicity to language. So in English, we have like 90 to 1 million different pronouns, right, of all different kinds, and people appreciate this diversity. And some people that identify with Z pronouns don't identify with they pronouns, precisely because they feel like the language they have created is a representation of their identity. So as much as we are engaged in a descriptive project here, trying to say what is going on in Latino America and other places, right? It's very odd for me as a researcher who tries to describe what's going on, because in a way I feel like I install a prescription, or I show how certain things can be regular in a language, but that is not necessary. It is necessary in terms of intelligibility, right? But the principle stands that all language is good language and anything you do is valid. So don't be afraid to experiment. And I always tell people, you are the innovators of language. By you participating in this and realizing your agency within language change, that is how from the bottom up, we start the process, basically. Sorry if you can hear our sounds over here.
Ben, thank you very much. Paola, repito la pregunta, si hay un tema que gustas retomar, que hemos hablado o que quieres agregarle.
No, I like the conversation. No, I don't feel something is outside. Besides emphasizing what I said at the beginning, it's a journey, it's a searching for something that is useful and not thinking we have found the ultimate way to be inclusive, no? Something like Ben said recently. I think if you are in that journey, it's a lot. Trying to find where to be more inclusive. It already shows sensibility and compassion needed to not let people out.
Yeah, I'm thinking that there's two different kinds of inclusive non-binary Spanish that are happening right now. And I've read several articles that say that non-binary Spanish is just rhetorical, like it's only used in signs, it's only used. And I think this ties back into what Paula was saying a bit ago too, of it's about what the intent is, I guess. So there's non-binary Spanish used for courtesy reasons, like at the beginning of a talk, you say, bienvenidos, bienvenidas, bienvenidas, and you never do it again. And then there's no binary Spanish that, like the kind that I use, which is I exist as a non-binary person, so like I'm going to use it. So yeah, I'm not sure if where I'm going with this. I just feel like there's nebulously in my head, there's these two different categories that I need to tease more at in my research. And I think that also relates back to the todis thing that I was saying, or the presidente, in that case, it would depend on why you're using it. So if the purpose of using it is just to visibilize that sometimes presidents aren't men, then you can just do the le presidente, and that is fine. That is actually how I do it currently, because switching from A to E takes a lot of work, and I am not at that point yet. I need to be, I want to be. But if you're using it to speak about a non-binary person, and it's a longer thing, and you can't keep adding words that are marked in other ways in order to disambiguate, then it might make more sense to pick up the E or pick up some other strategy. So yeah, it matters whether it's just like a courtesy thing or whether you're speaking about a specific person and why you're using non-binary I was going to say Spanish, but non-binary language, whichever language in general as well.
Could I actually pop in and ask a question here, Artemis? This is based on something I've read some of your work, and I'm familiar with some of the concepts that you've actually taught me a lot through. And one of the things I wanted to ask is, I think there's a perception often that inclusive language or non-binary language is for a certain group of people, right? There's people that don't need it, and then there's people that it's for. It's designed to, cater to this group of people. And I think that in a lot of ways that can be a damaging perspective to have. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of, isn't it actually the case that in many senses it's beneficial for everyone, just in maybe different ways? And so maybe there are some groups that feel, it's especially important for them to represent themselves and to self-identify using non-binary language, but are there benefits sort of for society as a whole if we can just sort of deconstruct the gender binary a little bit and move in this direction?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do try to make the distinction of, I would not tell my mom, like I would not use the E to speak directly to my mom because she uses the morpheme, so that would be disrespectful. I would be misgendering my mom. But if I'm speaking about a person at the store, I will, in the same way that in English I would speak about them, in Spanish I will use the E, even if they very probably are a binary person, right? But I can't know. And my quick answer in these things is that when we are using neomorphemes, right, whether it's the E, the X, whatever it is, when we're using neomorphemes in Spanish, we are, I guess some people are, I feel like the intention should not be to label a person as non-binary, but rather to not use the masculine or the feminine. And I think this is easier maybe to explain in English because we have all of these pronouns, right? So there's all of these genders and there's all of these pronouns and you can pick and choose, and that's great. But in Spanish, I mean, all languages have a limited amount of sounds that we can produce. We're going to run out of morphemes. We can't just have infinite pronouns like in English. So it should be, I feel like it was intended as rejecting the masculine or the feminine rather than labeling as one thing.
If I can kind of, with the permission of the panel, share where I'm at in the conversation and see if we can maybe use that as a context to elicit more directives, whether it's from the audience. I was thinking that some of the things that I have been working with is this relation between language and culture, as I framed earlier. However, one of the questions that I think we can also address is, what is the role of gender in our conception? So that when I hear the frame or the direction of thinking about how language is used and the analysis of being intent on resisting, challenging, or opening new opportunities to exist in our own spaces, calling out gender as a construct itself, does that offer us opportunities to bring back to language? So how much of our work requires us or takes us in directions of questioning gender itself? And that is the question that I'm very curious to see if it applies to any of your respective points of work. And I'll begin with Artemis and then move in reverse order.
I think that would be tied to my last question. So also when I explain these things, I say that there isn't just one third gender, right? When we start explaining non-binary genders, people just jump straight to like, okay, great. So it's not men and women, it's men, women, non-binary is great. These are the boxes and you are in the non-binary box. And it's not, I usually have like this little spectrum, right, of colors. And I go like, it's not like this, it's like an entire circle of colors and you see the things like, okay, this green over here is men and this orange over here is women, and like everything else is all the non-binary colors. And that's the same with the pronouns, right? Or with the morphemes. And that's why the is should be like everything else. So I do think that is a part of my research, just trying to explain what non-binary is, why non-binary matters to me, why it should matter to everyone, because I think we should not in the turfy way, but we should go about deconstructing gender. Some people are very attached to their genders, and that is great. Some people are not, and whatever gender somebody is. I also equate this a lot to like people's zodiac signs, right? Like you're born in this culture under these circumstances, and you are expected to grow up to be in this way. I think it's great that I myself am Sagittarius, and I think Sagittarius are great, but that doesn't mean that I should have special privileges over Scorpios. I don't know. So I think that is tied into my work. It just, yeah, I guess I can't go about non-binary language without explaining why non-binary things matter. I just try not to get too into it because that can very quickly get into turfy gender abolition stuff and into, even with it, even keeping out the gender abolition stuff, just invalidating trans people's genders, cis people's genders too, but trans people have more problematic or more traumatic experiences with their gender. So I particularly don't want to invalidate trans people's genders. And it's very easy to say gender isn't real and just screw everyone else over and keep going. So I try not to, but it's hard.
Thank you. Ben?
I just would like to echo that point. It calls for a complete reconceptualization. But it's not, in fact, people think that gender theory is so new, and what we are trying to draw out, and I in my last response was trying to draw, is that indigenous gender and the fact that there are so many is actually one of the oldest concepts that we have. So in sort of connecting the past to the present, I find it's very important for people, so in this method of decolonization, right, we have a lot of contexts, like in the white United States, I'm going to say, that is sort of removed from an indigenous context, in which that context was originally European, right? And in those societies, the system of gender was so rigid, right? But then the way that these languages make contact with each other, the ways that identities are evolving over time, and the ways that identities have been in the past prior to colonial processes and lots of other imperial processes like globalization, which now wants to say that everyone around the world that is queer at all can be gay, lesbian, or bisexual, like we import these terms from English, right, is a very hegemonic sort of a project. So it calls for a complete reconceptualization and an understanding of the fact that gender is not two, gender is not a binary thing, right? This is the way we have mapped it onto what we see as a binary biological division. Not even that biological division is binary, right? So we have to deconstruct all the concepts that are layered on top of one another.
Thank you. Paola?
¿Puedes repetirme la pregunta en español?
Sí.
It's a really complex question for me. I don't think I get it.
La pregunta es si dentro de tu conversación aplicas el contexto de estudiar o de analizar el tema de género en sí. Entonces, estamos hablando de lenguajes y obviamente inclusividad y género, pero dentro de la conversación que estamos escuchando aquí, se refiere mucho al contexto de género. Pero el tema de género para ti es algo que tú aplicas investigación apartado en su propio término o cómo lo manejas?
Ok. Voy a intentar entender la pregunta y contestar algo. No lo aplico. Para mí no es un área de investigación, para mí es la vida. Yo trabajo con consultantes, soy psicóloga y doy clases a grupos de personas muy grandes. Si pienso en lenguaje desde el punto de vista en que lo estamos usando, pienso que el lenguaje es comunicación y trato de que la persona a la que hablo sienta que le hablo a ella o él. Así que es algo que estoy aplicando constantemente. Cuando tengo grupos de alumnos de distintos géneros y no conozco su identidad de género, utilizo el inclusivo, utilizo la E. Cuando tengo un consultante particular le pregunto cómo quiere ser llamada. También coincido con Ártemis que la E no marca necesariamente una identidad de género no binaria, sino algo inclusivo de ellas y ellos también, pero con consultantes particulares pregunto porque creo, desde donde yo trabajo, enseñando o dando psicoterapia, que quiero que la persona sienta que le estoy hablando a ella, siempre. Entonces intento potenciar eso. Así que no es un área, para mí de hecho no es para nada un área separada de la vida. Es algo que incluyo en mis comunicaciones laborales, en mis grupos, con mis terapeutas, con mis consultantes, en mis clases. Es algo que está vivo, como algo vivo en mi comunicación y algo a lo cual estoy atenta y me lleva mucha energía. Una de las barreras para el uso del lenguaje inclusivo es la energía que lleva. Sí, obvio, ¿no? Porque uno aprendió a hablar con el masculino genérico, lleva mucha energía y creo que vale totalmente la pena la energía, el esfuerzo que lleva eso, y también creo que está bien equivocarse, está bien fallar al usarlo, está bien que mi consultante o mis alumnos me puedan decir, Paula, dijiste todo, bueno, lo siento, estoy aprendiendo. Pero para mí es el camino, ¿no? El compromiso a usarlo sin ser perfecto vale la pena, y sí lleva esfuerzo y creo que vale la pena. ¿Era por ahí, Daniel? Por favor, corregime si no es por ahí.
Danny, you're
Let
on
me
mute. There you are.
apologize. Let me paraphrase Paola briefly and offer some commentary. One of the things, the question itself was open just to see how many different directions we could have in terms of gender as a concept that in the field of anthropology, we work as one of the ways that we kind of study communities, and language is another, they're tied. But for a minute, we can consider what is gender, and that's what I posed. And Paola stated that it was not an area that she works as itself, but in her work, psychology, counseling, it does come about, and she talks about it as being central to communication, in particular the idea of gender theory or gender context as being full of energy, being alive. Gender is alive. And within that context, the space of considering permission to really stumble through it as people correct you, as you correct yourself. And it's something that I want to piggyback, as I heard Ártemis and Ben mention, that gender is something that is used differently by different communities, whether it be like gender deconstruction, the questioning of a gender concept that can be untangled, the questioning of even, is it useful? Will it injure some of us? And considering gender as a living spectrum. So when we talk about language, I think that's where I hear the conversation returning to, that as it is alive, questioning its history, its trajectory. And one of the directions that I see or I hear recurring is the questioning of the colonial template in our lives. So as we think of this next part of the conversation, I'm interested in hearing the future, the directions. Where is language going for us? In terms of maybe the context of decolonization, decolonial theory, decolonial movements, many of us are versed in the ways that indigenous communities recently, for example, here in the United States, we had Indigenous Peoples' Day on the 11th, and decolonial theory, decolonial movements are very much active, and they're not active just simply in the sense of like political rhetoric, but in our language, so that we are renaming ourselves. We are asking, demanding, expecting people to choose the languages that we and the terms that we decide for ourselves. Can we speak about that? Think about the future, the directions that we take respectively in language as a place of, to paraphrase Paula, take on that energy and livelihood. I'll ask Ben to start us off
Thank you so much. Please intervene if I lose track of your question because it was a very good one. But I'd like to say that the way that I treat all of the language change that's going on to represent non-binary people's identities is a practice of decolonization. So I just would like to be clear that I accept that completely. I'm very inspired by Maria Lugones, who describes the process of the coloniality of gender, right? And how these categories were imposed, and it was a set of world-making processes all entangled together, right? And so in a very clearly colonial context like Spanish, we can definitely say that some sort of decolonization of the language is going on, whether or not people would like to identify with that sort of ideology, and they don't have to. For me, the principles and the context of Latin America, Latino America, sorry, I was trying to code switch, definitely point to the fact that this is a decolonial process. That leads me to wonder, what can we call it for the rest of the world that are in very different contexts, right? So for instance, if the Swedes are now trying to ungender their language, what's going on there? And whether we're using that language or a different set of ideologies and theories, right? What's going on is really about human rights more fundamentally. So my message and the ways that I sort of do my research and describe what's going on, we're going to get to this comment in the chat. Someone called me a proposalist or something, and so that just made my day. Instead of prescriptivist or descriptivist, I'm using that for the rest of my life. Thanks so much. The way that I look at it is I am hoping to provide access to gender inclusive language, right? And this is the way that I see the world moving in. So we are all very much invested in access to gender inclusive language, which can look a lot of different ways. So in English language culture, we have normalized pronoun culture, right? Or not assuming people's pronouns, maybe asking before we sort of open our mouths, right? This is a very good practice. On Zoom here today, you can see a great exhibition of this practice in terms of my sort of pronouns in my Zoom handle, right? And we are trying to visibilize the issue. And I think that in general, whether or not a lot of things are being proposed in a certain language or not, there is an active queer community around the world that is conscious about this issue and really working towards the same goal. So no matter what we call it, this reality of, I wouldn't even call it ungendering, right? But making languages more gender fair and making languages more gender representative is actually going on everywhere, regardless of how we sort of would like to place generalizations. And that goal is a fundamental humanitarian goal of access to gender inclusive language or non-binary language for all. That's sort of my own interpretation, or maybe just my own position as a researcher.
Thank you. Paola, la pregunta es sobre nuevas direcciones. En particular, el contexto que he estado escuchando es decolonización. Quería saber qué direcciones toman el grupo en sí. ¿Qué dirección tomas tú?
No conozco mucho lo suficiente sobre historia y colonización como para asociar este movimiento a eso y defenderlo de alguna manera, pero sí creo que tiene que ver con un movimiento de visibilización de minorías que no afecta solo al lenguaje. Y por supuesto, cuando hay colonización hay una minoría colonizada, silenciada, invisibilizada. Desde donde yo lo veo hay un movimiento un poco más amplio en relación a derechos de minorías y el lenguaje acompaña de manera muy relevante, creo yo, a lo que son estas minorías de identidad de género. Pero también veo en el mundo cierta intención, hay intenciones contrarias también, pero veo cierta intención a nivel mundial de hacer visible lo invisibilizado en cuanto a las minorías en muchos aspectos políticos, sociales, económicos, con lo cual me parece que de alguna manera esto acompaña la ampliación de derechos que afectan otras áreas y esta en particular. También los derechos de las mujeres. Sé que estamos hablando bastante de identidades no binarias, pero sí, al menos en Argentina, hay un movimiento feminista muy fuerte, no tan radical en el sentido de que incluya solo a las mujeres, sino un movimiento feminista de visibilización de minorías, en donde creo que impacta a muchos niveles, y creo que tiene que ver con ampliación de derechos, en varios sentidos. Y este es uno que particularmente me resulta muy importante, supongo por mi historia de aprendizaje.
Gracias. I'll just paraphrase briefly. Paula's context really highlights the idea of visibility, challenging silencing. One of the issues that she identifies is the model of, or the pattern where colonization reduces people's visibility and silences, and the new directions are issues of human rights, with the intention to apply and amplify those rights. One of the things that she signals in particular is that within her local community, women, the voice of gendered women is being amplified, in particular feminism, so that when the question of new directions is posed, it's really thinking about highlighting visibility, and in particular the question of putting all these conversations within the issues of rights, human rights. Artemis.
So I think I'm that person, like nobody's saying open borders. I'm saying open borders. I'm saying linguistic anarchism. Let's go. So like, it's also what I was saying earlier of like this control and how language is being used for classist and ableist and all of these purposes. So I think that in rejecting the rule, particularly in Spanish, which, as we said, has these, basically laws by these people who decide to make the language laws, who I will not name because I do not give them publicity. Those people. I think that it's important to fight back against the laws just to make people realize that the laws aren't real. And I think that this does what I was saying about like I use regionalisms and I use like incorrect constructions knowingly, and that is totally fine because everybody languages correctly. I think that's one of the factors in me being into non-binary Spanish. Obviously, the big one is I'm non-binary and I use non-binary Spanish. But besides that, I think it's important for all sorts of inclusion and all sorts of equality. So yes, anti-colonialism, and yes, anti-classism and anti-ableism and all of these different things that I think can only be achieved through linguistic anarchism.
Thank you. I'm really excited by this common theme, which is embracing the change, embracing the difficulty of working with these different spaces. One of the things that I heard is how language not just frames, the way we speak and we think, but it also has the intention of explaining where we are. So that as we speak and we choose the terms that we want to be referenced as, it's an indicator of how we are trying to build a space of safety and comfort and strength. And what I find really exciting is this common identification that really challenges the authority of language, the way that language is dictated and instructed and told to us, this is the right way of speaking, this is the incorrect way of speaking. I hear from all three speakers a recurring position that maybe that's where we should be, the space of that incorrectness, and I'll put that in quote, but that many of us might have found ourselves uncomfortable with, like, is this the right word? Is this the wrong word? Am I safe in using this language? But I hear a recurring conversation that speaks to the livelihood, the energy of where we are right now, and the acceptance that maybe this is the place we should be, the idea of modeling, deconstructing the language, modeling, purposefully speaking correctly. I put that in quotes, an idea that as we speak, we create new words and new directions. In this moment of kind of like winding down the conversation, I would really like to ask of you if you can kind of summarize your your intent toward the public, in the sense that what are the takeaways that you would like us to have? I'll say it in Spanish. Paola, quería saber si podría pensar en cuáles son los resúmenes o puntos de dirección que gusta que el público tome de esa conversación. Voy a empezar en orden con Artemis, luego Ben y finalmente Paola. Artemis, would you start us off?
Yeah, I want to echo what Ben was saying earlier of it's okay in whichever way you use it as long as you are trying. I sometimes equate non-binary Spanish to learning a new variant of your language, like a new dialect. So if somebody told me that I need to vocear, like speak in Argentina right now, like I could sort of make it up, but I can't do it. It's going to require practice, right? And that is perfectly okay. And nobody would get mad at me for messing that up. And I think that should be in this way for non-binary Spanish. And ideally, it would also be this way from us non-binary people receiving the language, being languaged at. Obviously, that isn't going to always work because there's dysphoria and there's all sorts of different dynamics here. But I think that it's something that we are all learning together and we are all developing together. And that's also what's happening with the irregulars, which are really cool. And I think it's just great that people are excited to learn more, to research it, to like know more about it. And yeah, it's just really cool. And I'm really glad that they're all here and excited along with us.
Ben?
Yes, thank you so much. So my takeaways, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I'd like to just say a few things. So non-binary people are not new, right? The concept of there not being two genders and two sexes is not new, but we are experiencing a wonderful visibilization of non-binary identities within queer communities around the world. The sad fact is that when gender is grammaticalized and lexicalized in languages, it most often appears in its binary flavor. For that reason, language change is necessary. Not only is it necessary, it is a fundamental process of reclamation, right, of identity formation that we all need to take seriously. So all of the critiques that you hear about this not being real language and that not being real language, I want you to walk through the world seeing through those comments as some sort of ism, right? In the case of the institutions that Ártemis has described, right, their rejection of non-binary language is really a rejection of non-binary people, right? So these comments about language always reflect some other reality connected to people and our identities, right? And language is the primary tool that we have to be able to express those identities. And for that reason, maybe we need to change the language, right? Be kind to yourself in the process, be kind to others in the process. This is a relation, of course, gender is a relation, but a lot of us have a lot of privilege within that relation relative to others, right? And we do it for other people to include them in our relationality, which is a very good point in and of itself, right? And do this yourself. Try your best. You as agents of language change on the ground, as educators in the classroom, you are the ones that are really going to promote this going on in the world. And it has to happen bottom up. Even if the institutions tomorrow said, yep, we approve it, it would still take people going out, learning this language, speaking it, right? And normalizing it. And that's what I want all of you to consider doing.
Thank you. Paola, resumen o puntos de dirección.
Creo que Artemis y Ben dijeron bastante lo que estaba pensando. Me parece que en este punto el activismo es usarlo. Es un lugar pequeño y muy potente. Y sí, lo que quisiera, no sé si las personas que están en esta charla todas están interesadas en usarlo, vienen a curiosear, a ver qué es eso, ¿no? No voy a asumir que todas las personas están interesadas en usarlo, pero sí hubo una investigación en Argentina en donde la intención de uso era alta y el uso era muy bajito. Y es interesante para que pensemos, muchas personas quieren usarlo, la intención de uso es alta y el uso es bajito. Y parte de los factores que explican que el uso sea más bajo es, por un lado, el desconocimiento de las fórmulas inclusivas y por otro, la extrañeza. de escucharlo y de usarlo, con lo cual yo sí creo que con que una persona lo use en contextos relevantes vamos a disminuir esa extrañeza y probablemente entrenar de manera indirecta las fórmulas inclusivas que a veces dan miedo y dan vergüenza. Así que eso, si tienen la sensibilidad suficiente para pensar que esto importa, usarlo personalmente para mí ya es una influencia muy grande.
Gracias. Let me try and briefly summarize Paola's discussion in terms of her work or directions of takeaways. It's the emphasis on activism and being comfortable with being uncomfortable in its use, to be intentional in practicing, to be intentional in the exercise, in particular to really think about that awkwardness, the strange component to using new words or new ways of speech. As we become more in practice with it, that uncomfortableness will be reduced. A key component is the sensibility to know that there is a movement that is happening, an activist movement, and that we can participate. What I'd like to kind of think about is, as we have a couple minutes, is really consider questions from the audience. I know that we haven't really been able to capitalize. One of the easiest ways would be to use the chat. I can read through it, or if you can, I think the chat is probably the easiest way, but I welcome some questions so that we can kind of think of new directions of the conversation.
Yeah, one thing in the chat that we might start with. Oh, sorry, Alexandra, do you have a question? You can go ahead.
Hi everyone. It's nice to finally be able to meet Ártemis and Ben online, because I've been following both of them on Twitter like crazy. So yeah, I'm like really nervous, but I'm really happy to be here. I am a doctoral student from the University of California, Irvine, and I'm also studying non-binary Spanish. And I am a native Spanish speaker myself, as English as like a second language, or kind of like a simultaneous bilingual or something like that. And so I'm just really happy and just really excited to be here to like kind of like having this conversation with everyone. And I kind of like wanted to kind of like share my experience of like of what non-binary Spanish looks like in Puerto Rico. And so in Puerto Rico, we're kind of like a modern colony. Like we are a part of the States, but we're not for some other things. And so it's what I like, it's un revolú, right? And so sometimes like we inherit a lot of like, you know, but we were first colonized by Spain. So we like the Spanish speaking community is very purist, is very prescriptivist. And like Ártemis, I just laughed with their story because I was also a prescriptivist myself. I would like be carrying the dictionary and like upholding the rules of that organization and things like that until I found linguistics and until I found non-binary Spanish at my institution. And it's just really interesting to see just like how there is like a push from like the youth, Puerto Rican youth, to use it even if they themselves don't identify as non-binary. And so even, you know, because we're at the university, we're trying to create an inclusive space. And what's most interesting is that it not only stays in the university, but just go outside, go to a lot of queer-friendly places, and you will see like there's this place called Lover Bar, and you'll say that the sign says "Bienvenidos a todos." Lover Bar es para todos, and things like that. And so it is very interesting. Like so as a PhD student here in the States, like whenever I talk about my research, people ask me, "Oh, but you're imposing this on like the community." I'm like, wait, what are you talking about? In my context, it's totally different. Like it comes from the Spanish speaking queer community. And so like me coming here to the States, I noticed that there's a whole different dialogue going around this. And so I think that the solution, that maybe like a solution we have, is we definitely need to like educate people that this isn't something that's coming out of the void. This is something that's happening. And as linguists, as sociologists, psychologists, like our job is to like study this and understand this and know that this comes from like a point. And like everything in language, for example, I'll take African American English. Like it was just demonized for just so long time. Kids would be classified as having a speech language impairment or a language disability order, when now we know that that's not the case. And so it's normal when new phenomena like emerge to we experience this kind of like pushback. But we as researchers, our job is to like educate the people. And I just want to take this opportunity to congratulate Ártemis and Ben and Paula and everyone here, because these are the kinds of conversations we need to be happening. And so yeah, that was great. And I also hope to be able to share some of my work in the future relating to non-binary Spanish. I mean, I'm still starting out, so I just have like something very small. But yeah, thank you everyone, and thank you for listening to me talk.
Thanks, Alexandra. That was awesome.
Thanks, Alexandra. I'll just chime in and say, when we finish the talk, I am going to invite the panelists to contribute any resources that they want the audience to sort of have as a take home after the fact, and we can put those on the website as well. So Alexandra, feel free if you want to contribute some things that we can have as sort of food for thought to continue the conversation afterwards. Feel free to shoot me an email. We can include that in that.
Am I able to respond to a question I got in the chat? Is that okay?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. Go for it.
I'm going to read it back from a different screen since I lost it. So here, this is from Yarubi. So Ben, I'll read it in Spanish and then we'll do a little translanguaging. So muchas gracias por tus intervenciones. Tengo dos preguntitas para ti, por si las puedes integrar a tu intervención o responder por aquí. La primera es metodológica. Pude ver que tu trabajo de bachillerato hiciste entrevistas con personas no binarias. ¿Seguiste usando esa metodología en tu MA o ahora en tu PhD? ¿O de qué manera estás observando usos inclusivos no binarios? Creo que es una muy buena pregunta. Para mi tesis de la maestría, entonces primero en español, después en inglés, lo siento. Para mi tesis de la maestría, yo estaba entrevistando a mis propios estudiantes. Entonces, por eso no les pregunté su género. So for my master's thesis, I was working with my own students out of convenience, you could say, right? And I didn't necessarily ask them their genders, just because it was an interpersonal conflict. But all of my research is explicitly and meant to be based on non-binary people and communities. So in my BA thesis, I interviewed them. And then all of the data that I collect to make grammars that you'll find on the Gender and Language Project, and hopefully many more soon, are derived from non-binary people specifically, and their uses of this language online, in different publications and community level publications, academic ones, so on and so forth. Y la segunda pregunta de Yarubi es, en la proposición de la gramática inclusiva en tu proyecto, ¿basas la elección del sufijo X por los usos que has observado por algún otro motivo? So the question, sorry, I will say it in English now, is what do you base your sort of centralizing the X in your research and your resources on, if I interpret correctly? Y diría que estoy enfocado en esta historia muy importante del decolonialismo con la X, y por eso quiero representar primero ese género. Según mi contexto, que estoy en América, estoy en los Estados Unidos, ¿no? Y para mí es súper importante. So I sort of represent the X first in the publications that I write in gender inclusive Spanish and in the resources that I make, because it has a very strong, locally meaningful, decolonial sort of context to me and my own communities, right? I think maybe you have perceived in our conversation that my assessment is that the E is a little bit more popular, and it sort of, I could say one or two things about how it fits with the language, but I actually will spare those comments because everything is just as valid, right? But the E, as we were talking about in the chat, is an excellent resource in the language, which is sort of likely to catch on, right? And so, but I just make sure to represent the X as well, while language sort of moves in one direction or the other. Y muchas gracias, Yarubi, por la pregunta.
Gracias a ti. Thank you.
One other question from the chat that I thought we might bring up was from Kylie Booth, actually, and I was sort of thinking along the same lines, so I'm going to sort of piggyback off of her comment. But it was about, what is your advice for dealing with folks who are either resistant, or maybe they're not resistant, but they're just very unfamiliar? So a little bit of personal context. I'm an LGBT person from the reddest place on the planet, perhaps, which is rural Indiana. Very Republican state, very anti-progressive in many, many ways. So I wondered if you guys could talk about, maybe in spheres that are a little bit less welcoming, or even in spheres where there's just not as much awareness, sort of what your personal strategies are to promote inclusive language. Of course, we talked about, just doing it oneself is already a step in the direction, and it's not necessarily a matter of imposing our will on somebody else. But are there ways that you sort of spread the good news about inclusive language that have worked well for you?
So because it affects me directly, I guess I have like a few different strategies, right? I've taken, since I moved to Spain, people will gender me. Obviously in the US, you don't gender somebody really in the second person, so it doesn't happen, but I go into the store and everyone genders me. So I have taken an approach when speaking to strangers, in that they don't know my name, they don't know my sign, they don't know my gender, and like they're making their own assumptions, but I've chosen not to care. I will speak about myself, like I will gender myself correctly, but I am not engaging with that. My colleagues and cohort and stuff, thankfully, have been super supportive, and they try. So they're at the step of learning, and I welcome all learning, and that is great. I guess the problem would come in if I had, I don't know, a colleague at the university that didn't want to, and again, because it affects me directly, that would be them directly denying my gender. So I would just take that as, okay, great, you're transphobic, goodbye. So I think ironically, I have like a very binary approach here of like, you either support me or you do not. I do think that some people who are against non-binary Spanish are sort of scared. Like, it's not that they are binarist, it's not that they're transphobic, it's just that there's this new thing that they don't know how to use, and they've seen that if you fuck up on Twitter, people will get mad at you on Twitter. Or if you fuck up in public, people will get mad at you in public, right? And I've definitely seen that, and I think that that's part of why I try not to get mad at people unless they're being directly aggressive toward me, because they are learning. So I think that, yeah, if you see that people get yelled at for messing it up, you're not even going to try, and it's much easier to just say that it's wrong. So I try to speak to people a little bit about it. I compare it a bit to I mentioned the generic feminine earlier, and how some people will use the generic feminine. So I try to equate it to that. Like, you do not need to use a generic A or X or whatever in the same way that you do not need to use a generic feminine, but you do need to speak in the feminine to women and people who use that morpheme. So you should speak to me using the A, even if you do not use it for anyone else. And that's generally worked. But again, that's considering that, like, I don't correct people in the street, because who cares? They don't know my name. So that's been my strategy, really.
Thanks, Ártemis.
What I also do is share research in contexts that matter about how, for example, suicidality increases when people is not named or no as they want. Usually in clinical context or in training context, not in the street. I'm not going with the paper under my arm. Well, I can do that also, but not yet. But usually talking about the problems that can generate in mental health, not being able to make the effort of using the pronoun the person wants or the name, and how the impact of that, because sometimes the people that is resistant, maybe they don't have an idea of what is the effect, and it's critical sometimes. So sharing about the consequences of not making that effort, sometimes it's useful. Some other times it's not. It depends on the flexibility of each person, of course.
That was wonderful, Paula. I think a lot about you and what you do as a psychologist, because I read so many papers that sort of are case studies of people being cared for by psychologists in which they feel like the language is against them, right? And like we can connect those two things. A language can be against someone if the people that sort of constructed it to be shaped a certain way enabled that to happen, right? So I think maybe in these relational terms, it's great to say that this sort of gendered language is a relation. And the way that I identify as one gender or the other is relative to you, to everyone else, right? So it's actually about all of us when we use inclusive language. Like as of yet, we still don't have actual neutral ways of referring to people in Spanish. And why would we need this for everyone? Maybe in a legal context, there could be some specificity that it's consequential in, right? But on the level of community, we need to make sure that everyone's identities can be respected and can be included. So this binary of transphobic versus non-transphobic that Ártemis is sort of pointing out, this is one, right? It can be divorced from language. People can consider this to be something new, but once they understand the transphobia and the non-binary phobia that is sort of at the crux of our emergence of gender inclusive language and non-binary language, right? That is the point right there, is like, this is an issue about rights, and language are a reflection of our rights in society at the moment. That's what I would say.
At this moment, I want to go ahead and unfortunately close the conversation. I want to thank everyone, the audience, as well as the panelists, and Papadopoulos, Paula José Quintero, Ártemis López. Your direction is encouraging. I feel that you provided us with so many tools for us to take away. I hope we get an opportunity to continue to engage and learn from you. And I thank you personally as a panel, as well as everyone involved and everyone that participated in putting this together. So, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a todos. Que estén muy bien.
Gracias. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Fue un placer y I learned a lot. So I'm really happy to be here. Gracias.
Thank you so much, y'all.